Connecticut Representative Himes, Representative Himes called for President Biden to drop out of the presidential race right after Mr. Biden's NATO press conference, and he is the ranking member of the House Intel Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Let me get your reaction.
Well, I think it's not just me. I think it's, an awful lot of my colleagues who are reacting with a combination of relief, elation and gratitude. Relief that the split in the party, which was painful, as people sort of tried to figure out what to do. As you pointed out, I made my views known some time ago and pretty early. Elation, because I think there is a sense now that while we need to work out exactly what the ticket looks like, there's obviously a lot of momentum developing behind the vice president, but elation that I think we are now in the hunt to win this presidency. And then gratitude, of course, to Joe Biden. It was, I can speak for myself, it was enormously painful, given his accomplishments, given his decades of public service, to realize that he would probably lose to Donald Trump. So an immense amount of gratitude that Joe Biden chose to do what Nancy Pelosi did, which is to, at the very height of their powers, to step aside in favor of, probably a new generation. Not an easy thing to do when you are that powerful a person.
Congressman Himes, are you prepared to endorse Kamala Harris?
So I'm a big Harris fan, and I've been sort of arguing in the background as people said, well, what comes next? I've been arguing that, the vice presidency is a job that does not allow you to shine, right? And when you are vice president, every word you utter has to be consistent with the beliefs of the president, or you're not doing your job. I'm a big believer that Harris, when she is sort of freed from that obligation, her numbers are likely to rise and rise dramatically. Now, I was out mowing my lawn 3 hours ago when I got the news. And so I haven't crafted a statement. I haven't sort of checked in with leadership. I do things in concert with my colleagues and that sort of thing. But I can tell you right now that I am a big Harris fan. And I think that Harris at the top of the ticket, an African-American woman, a prosecutor up against a, convicted felon. I could get pretty excited about that ticket.
Congressman, thank you. Margaret Brennan is here with me as well.
Congressman Himes, I did read a note here from you. You said it's up to us to work as never before to defeat the dark authoritarian vision of Donald Trump. I wonder in this moment, given your role in the Intelligence Committee, what you think the message is to the world in terms of this upheaval within the American political system and the uncertainty as to the well-being of the commander-in-chief and his ability to continue making decisions in an effective way. Your Republican colleague, Mike Turner, on the Intelligence Committee has called for President Biden to step aside immediately, saying if he can't, make it through the race, that he shouldn't be in the Oval Office now.
Yeah, Margaret, I'm very disappointed by that line of thinking. And by the way, I'm going to resist the temptation to ask my Republican colleagues to look at their own candidate, convicted of 34 felony counts, adjudicated sexual abuser and rapist. Don't come pointing at us about the caliber of our candidate. What I will tell you, though, is that this notion that Joe Biden can't complete his term as president is bananas. And as you know, I was one of the early ones out saying that he should step aside. The question in stepping aside is more about, can you beat Donald Trump, and can you then serve 4 more years? That's the president. That's the decision that the president made. So these calls from Republicans for the president to step aside. First of all, I understand why they're angry. They now realize what I realize, which is that there's a good chance that they lose. Earlier in the program, you read the statement by the Russians. The Russians, of course, had a very, very bad day because it looked like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance was going to, we're going to waltz into the Oval Office and stop support for Ukraine. But you know what? I would counsel my Republican friends, look at your own candidate before you start talking about Joe Biden.
Congressman Himes, stand by. I just want to go to Robert Costa because he has some new information. He just spoke with Donald Trump on the record. Robert?
I just spoke with former President Donald Trump on the phone. I asked the former president about his reaction to the news. He said that it's a shock to the country. It's a shock to the country, but he believes it's good for the country to see President Biden decide to step aside. He believes that President Biden was pressured out of the race. I asked him if he's willing to debate Vice President Harris. He said, I'm not sure she is going to be the Democratic nominee. He's waiting to see how the Democratic race emerges. He has not made any statement, he said, or conclusion about who the Democratic nominee will be, but he is thinking through the race. I asked him, will this change how you proceed with your own presidential campaign? He said, absolutely not. This is about policies. She carries, if she's the nominee or anyone else carries, the Biden record. He said to me in CBS News, he is running against the Biden administration, whether it's Vice President Harris or not. He expressed, in a sense, not sympathy for President Biden in any way, but he, as a political observer, believes that the Democrats took out one of their own with this pressure campaign. And he said that he, at this point, is just waiting to see what emerges in the Democratic Party. He said, I am going to run against what he called the worst presidential administration in history. He believed, in his view, that President Biden's not up for the job. So he said, quote, to CBS News just now, that it's good for the country that he's getting out. But he said this is a total shock to the country to have a president forced out by his own party. And he kept insisting the race continues as is in his view.
It's interesting to hear from Donald Trump and that exclusive interview that you just had with him. I wonder, though, how worried the campaign is. Donald Trump ran against a woman, Hillary Clinton, in 2016. It was personal. He called her nasty. He called her a lot of other words. I wonder whether those same types of attacks would work in 2024. There will be a different dynamic running against a black woman.
It was evident on my conversation, and it was a conversation, not an exclusive interview. It was a conversation I had with former President Trump on the phone. I called him up. And what's evident to me, I just spoke to Donald Trump Jr. within the last hour on text message and spoke by phone to former President Trump. What this country should be prepared for, based on what I heard from former President Trump, who I've known for many years as a reporter, have covered him extensively. What's on the horizon now is political war. It is going to be rougher than anything we've seen. His tone on the phone, his description of what's coming ahead on the horizon, even though he didn't pledge in any way to debate Vice President Harris, because he kept noting that she's not the nominee formally, so who should he debate? Why should he commit to debating her when I pressed him on the issue in our conversation? But he kept going on, this is the worst administration. He said he went on his position on immigration, that in his view, they have destroyed the border. They need to be held accountable. I'm going to hold whoever runs against me accountable for what's going on at the border. And he went on and on that particular issue. And he said he believes on the issue of the economy and the immigration, he can win this election, whether it's Vice President Harris as the nominee or someone else. And he expressed a lot of confidence that his searing message and attacks on the Democratic record will be effective. And so this is a moment where Democrats are coming together, but Republicans clearly, based on my conversation with the former president, the Republican nominee, and his closest allies in the last couple hours, they are preparing to ramp up their attacks because as Democrats see this moment as one of togetherness, perhaps rallying around Vice President Harris, it should be noted that Republicans do see this publicly and especially behind the scenes as a moment of weakness for the Democratic Party, where there's a soft underbelly, politically speaking, for them to come in and attack the Democratic ticket as there is this moment of transition.
You know, I can remember the Bush-Kerry race and when John Kerry became the nominee. And I remember talking to a top official in the Bush campaign, and that official is saying to me, you know, only about this small slice of America really knows who John Kerry is. And as a Washington reporter, I said, what? He's a war hero. Everybody knows who John Kerry is. He's been in the Senate. He's been a prominent figure. And they said, no, and we're going to spend the next couple of months telling everybody what to believe about John Kerry, which became some of the most brutal attacks against a war hero, the Swift boat veterans, just to recall that campaign of late. It is true not many people, even though she is the vice president of the United States, know a lot about Kamala Harris. And so will begin what is an effort, as our campaigns are. They are political war, as you said, to paint her in a way from a campaign, the Donald Trump campaign, which is good at this type of political warfare.
And they've got a 4-week head start.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to have a convention for 4 weeks. And if she faces a challenge, she can't go out there and explain herself, and the Trump campaign can.
And I want to bring in Congressman Jim Himes, since you've run a number of campaigns yourself. What about that, about what becomes this political war?
Well, of course, the election was always going to be hard fought, but I can't disagree with the analysis more, that the idea that this is an underbelly of the Democratic Party, you know what, if you're Vladimir Putin and you rule as a totalitarian, if you're President Xi and you rule without the support of your people, if you're Donald Trump and in 2016, your own people, by the way, your own vice president, wanted to throw you overboard, I could see why this moment would be scary. But do not forget what this moment was. This moment was a moment in time when the most powerful man on the planet listened to his advisors, listened to members of Congress, listened to senators and the congressional leadership, and took a huge selfless step in the service of the country. So the framing of this thing as a weakness in the Democratic Party gets it 100% wrong. We had a debate, and the most powerful man on the planet listened and undertook a selfless act. Take that, Donald Trump. Let's see you try to pull something like that, Vladimir Putin. So yeah, look, we don't have a lot of time, but we are going to think about young people who were completely unexcited by Joe Biden and Donald Trump. African Americans, we've had a little bit of an issue with African Americans lately. These are things that the vice president, I think, is going to be in a natural position to address. Of course, the campaign matters, and of course, the campaigns are going to be tough. But I'm telling you that Democrats in Congress right now are feeling, and this explains Donald Trump's confusion as well, like we can win this thing.
Congressman Himes, it's Margaret Brennan again. For the public, Vice President Harris, she hasn't done a lot of interviews. They're few and far between when she does speak to reporters. She has the experience of being in the Oval Office alongside Joe Biden. You've been in meetings with her. I know she's been engaged on a lot of these key national security issues like Ukraine, certainly with Gaza and the crisis there. I wonder what you would explain to the public in terms of what you've seen about her ability to step into the role as commander-in-chief.
Well, remember, that's the definition of the vice president's role, that they are, and that's kind of the one thing they need to be. They need to be ready to assume the office of commander-in-chief in the case of a disaster. I can reflect on my own personal experience. For example, I was with the vice president at the Munich Security Conference. I saw her speech. I spoke with her there. I saw her in bilateral meetings with our allies. She is ready to go. Is Donald Trump and MAGA going to attack her? Of course they are. I think, as my friends in national security say, the attack area on Kamala Harris as a younger woman, former attorney general, former prosecutor, ready to go, is a lot smaller than it was on President Biden, as we all realized after that debate.
Congressman Himes, it's Ed O'Keefe is part of the coverage here. You are the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Your colleague Adam Smith, who's the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, also called for the president's step down. Mark Warner, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, a Democrat of Virginia, was among the earliest to call on him to go. Were you guys seeing something, or were you hearing something from national security and military officials about how the president's processing national security information that led you all to come out and say this? Because it looked like an awfully big coincidence that some of the loudest and earliest voices raising concerns were those of you leading national security committees.
Yeah, the answer to your question is absolutely not, and I can't explain why it was. We were 3 of the 30 or so members of Congress and senators who called for it, but it had nothing to do with concern about the president's fitness. Look, I think the president has a very solid domestic record with the infrastructure investments, with the capping of drug prices in Medicare. But foreign policy, though Donald Trump tries to take credit for this, upon the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was Joe Biden who pushed Europe to really become not just a talking shop in NATO, but actually a capable military operation. And while I've had my frustrations with the president for a little while at the speed with which we have supplied aid to Ukraine, we have made all of the difference. What the president was able to achieve, of course, in avoiding a regional war in the Middle East. You may remember after October 7th, a lot of us worried about a regional war with Hezbollah going to war with Israel. Again, Joe Biden, with the help of the United States ship Eisenhower, stopped that. The investments that have been made in the Indo-PACOM region, buttressing Taiwan, this is a record that gives none of us pause.
But there was nothing you were hearing from people at CIA or other intelligence agencies or the Pentagon that said he can't process this anymore, he's too old to do it?
Well, first of all, let me be super clear as the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. If somebody at the CIA or at any of the intelligence agency made a comment to me on the viability of the president, I would be extraordinarily concerned, because it is essential that the intelligence community remain 100% out of politics. But no, the answer to your question is an unconditional, unqualified no. There was never a moment where I thought that the whatever metaphor you want to use, the hand on the wheel or the finger on the trigger was not perfectly capable.